She heard Marcus introduce Vanessa as the woman who keeps our family together. 250 people applauded. She looked at the name card, Imani B, one initial, like whoever printed it was not sure she would show up. She had already shown up 14 years ago, in a county office in South Georgia, with $38,000 and a piece of land nobody wanted. The room just did not know it yet. The event was the 10-year anniversary gala of the Briggs Family Foundation, held on a Saturday evening in late August at a private estate outside Atlanta. Carolyn Briggs had rented the property for the occasion. She had been planning it since January. The lawn had been cut that same afternoon, and the smell of it, clean and green and faintly sharp, mixed with the guests' perfume and the warm evening air. String lights hung from the old oak trees down to each of the 8 long tables. White linen covered every surface. Sunflowers stood in tall vases at the center of each table, chairs painted white and arranged precisely. A violin duo played in the far right corner of the garden. The men wore navy or black. The women wore cream or soft neutral shades. It was the kind of event where every detail coordinated because someone had spent months ensuring it would. Imani arrived at 7:15, 40 minutes after the reception had opened. She had driven herself from a quarterly operations review meeting that had run long, a meeting she had called herself, a meeting about the next acquisition cycle for a Thei's Land Trust's southeastern portfolio, the kind of meeting none of the 250 people on that lawn would have believed she had the authority to convene. She walked through the estate's side gate and looked at the garden. She saw the table arrangement before she saw Marcus. 8 tables. The first was positioned closest to the small raised platform at the garden's head, where the program would be run later in the evening. One chair at that table had a name card face up and readable even from 30 feet away. Imani did not walk close enough to read it. The placement was information enough. That chair was beside Marcus. The 8th table was near the service entrance on the garden's left side, where a young woman in a catering uniform was moving back and forth through a propped open door with trays of empty glasses. Imani found her table. She found her seat. She looked at the name card. Imani Bey. Not Imani Okafor Briggs. Not Imani Briggs. Just a first name and a single letter. Like whoever had prepared the card had been uncertain whether she was still part of the family and had chosen the smallest version of her name as a compromise. She sat down. She picked up the folded menu card and read it from top to bottom. The MC called for the Briggs family to gather near the platform for the commemorative photograph. Marcus walked up first, easy and certain, the way he always moved through rooms that had been arranged to receive him. He reached back and took Vanessa Holt by the hand and drew her forward into the center position beside him. He did not look toward the 8th table. He did not pause. The gesture had the naturalness of something he had rehearsed until it no longer felt like a decision, just a fact. Vanessa wore a cream dress with fine embroidery along the sleeve hem. Small repeated shapes worked into the fabric. The embroidery pattern was one Imani had described to Marcus 10 months earlier at a boutique on Peachtree Street on one of the last Saturday afternoons they had spent together. She had pointed it out through the glass and said she liked the detail, the understatement of it. Marcus had nodded and looked at his phone. Vanessa did not look toward the 8th table. She had no reason to. Darnell, Marcus's younger brother, looked in Imani's direction once, registered her sitting alone at the table beside the kitchen service door, and turned back to the man seated next to him. They spoke. They laughed at something. Tamra, Marcus's younger sister, walked across the garden to the 8th table and set a glass of water in front of Imani. She did it without meeting Imani's eyes, without slowing her pace, without any of the small hesitations that would have indicated conflict. She did it the way you do a task that has been assigned and completed. Then she walked back toward the platform. Carolyn Briggs did not approach the 8th table at any point during the evening. She stood near the platform in a pale gold dress, holding a champagne flute. She watched her son arrange himself for the photograph with the ease of a woman who had spent a long time arranging things and knew when the arrangements were working. The photograph was taken. The violin continued. The catering staff moved. Imani ate the first course when it arrived at the 8th table, and read the program card and said nothing to anyone. She left before the main course, 9 o'clock. She drove herself out through the side gate the way she had entered, quietly, without announcement. 11 minutes from home, she pulled into a gas station, went inside, bought a bottle of water, and stood outside in the August heat for a few minutes. With her left hand, she turned the copper bracelet on her wrist. Slowly, once. The way you handle something you have carried for a long time when you need to feel what it weighs. Then she drove home. Go back now. Go all the way back, past Atlanta, and the estate, and the 8th table, and the name card that could not be bothered to include her full name. Go back before the acquisitions, before the quarterly reviews, before the $38,000 and the land in Telfair County. Go back to Enugu, in the southeastern part of Nigeria, where the roads were packed red dirt. The evenings came fast there and smelled like cook smoke and the wet pressure that arrives before rain in that part of the world. Go back to a girl of 9, sitting on the front step of her family's house with a book in her lap and bare feet in the red dust. Her father had died that year, a fast illness that did not negotiate. Her mother taught at the primary school 2 kilometers down the road and came home in the evenings with chalk dust on the elbows of her blouse and dinner already decided in her head before she crossed the threshold. They had the house, a small strip of land in the back, and Thei Obiageli. She was Imani's father's mother. She had occupied that house for 31 years, before Imani was born, and had every intention of occupying it until she was done. Thei Obiageli was small and deliberate, and had hands that had worked every day of their long life, and showed it. She managed the family's agricultural plots, a modest set of parcels accumulated across 3 generations, with a consistency that had no name in any language Imani knew yet. She would eventually recognize it in a graduate seminar on capital formation as long-horizon thinking. Each growing season, Thei walked the perimeter of each plot with small wooden stakes. She pressed them into the soil at measured intervals, marking the boundary of each crop zone, recording what had been rested and what was ready to work. Then she would return to the kitchen table and open her black notebook and write her numbers in it. Projected yields, harvest windows, exchange estimates for the buyers who came twice a year from 2 districts over. She wrote in a hand that was even and unhurried and that left no space for misreading. Nobody asked to see the notebook. She did not write it for anyone to see. She wrote it because the land needed to know someone was paying attention to it. Imani watched this happen for years before she asked about it. Thei, where did you learn to keep the books that way? No one asked you to. Thei looked at her across the kitchen table. She set her pen down. The land does not argue. It simply holds. Then she pushed the notebook across the table and pointed to a column near the bottom of the open page. Read me the figures from the 3rd planting season. Imani read them aloud. Thei picked up the notebook and went back to her work. The lesson was complete. Imani did not fully understand what had been taught to her until years later. But some lessons do not require understanding on arrival. They wait in the body until the body needs them. She was 19 when she applied to Howard University in Washington, D.C. The scholarship was full and competitive and covered everything. She had written 3 drafts of the application essay. She had not told her mother she was applying until the acceptance arrived, because Thei had taught her, without a word of explicit instruction, that you do not announce what you have not yet confirmed. The morning of her flight, the sky was still mostly dark. She came out the front door with her bag and found Thei sitting on the step with bare feet on the red dirt, the way she sat every morning before the sun had finished rising. Thei did not stand. She looked up at Imani for a moment. Then she reached over with both hands, unhurried and deliberate, and removed the copper bracelet from her own left wrist. The metal was old, worn smooth by decades against her skin, the surface carrying the particular dull warmth of something that has been held for a very long time. 3 small characters were cut into it in an Igbo dialect specific to Thei's home village, 3 letters that meant nothing to anyone who had not grown up inside the particular history that produced them. Thei placed the bracelet into Imani's palm and closed Imani's fingers around it. She looked up at her. The land does not argue. It simply holds. She said it with the tone of a person handing you both the key and the instruction at the same time, and trusting you to figure out which door it opens. Imani stood there for a moment. The sky was turning at the edge, that first thin gray-gold seam at the horizon that comes before full light. She put the bracelet on her wrist. She picked up her bag. She walked to the airport. She did not take it off again. The notebook was still on Imani's shelf. Not the original, which had stayed in Enugu with the family when Imani left, but the one she had started in Washington in her first year at Howard, a black notebook with plain lined pages, modeled on Thei's exactly. She had kept it, and the ones that followed it, for 20 years. There were 11 of them now, stacked in order on the bottom shelf of her home office. Every acquisition, every estimate, every projection she had written down, not because anyone asked, but because the work deserved to be recorded by someone who took it seriously. Thei had died in the spring of the year Imani turned 24. Imani had flown back for the funeral. She had stood at the grave in the red dirt with the copper bracelet on her left wrist, and had not cried, not because she did not grieve, but because Thei had never cried at things that were simply true. Imani held the bracelet and thought about the black notebook and the boundary stakes. She thought about the way Thei had pushed the notebook across the kitchen table all those years ago and said, "Read me the figures from the third planting season." Not, "I love you." Not, "You will do great things." Not, "I am proud of what you will become." Just, "Read me the numbers. Do the work. Pay attention." That was the whole instruction. It had been enough for a lifetime. At Howard, she was extraordinary in the way that quiet people are always extraordinary, slowly, without announcement, in ways that accumulate over time and do not announce themselves until someone stops and adds up the total. She studied agricultural business, food systems, economics, and policy. She read everything the curriculum assigned and then read what it did not. She worked a second job, 22 hours a week, in the university's administrative offices. She did not complain about this. It was a resource constraint, and she managed resource constraints the way Thei had taught her to manage land, precisely and without drama. After Howard, she completed her MBA at Georgetown in 2 years, graduating with a concentration in private equity and asset management. At 26, in the spring following her graduation, she sat in the office of a county recorder in Telfair County, Georgia, and signed the acquisition deed for a failing corn operation that nobody else had been interested in purchasing. The entity she used to purchase it was registered as ADA's Land Trust. Adai's was Thei's full given name. The trust existed in public records as a small agricultural holding company with a registered agent in Atlanta and a filing history that would have drawn no particular attention from anyone not specifically looking for it. Marcus Briggs did not exist yet in her life. She was 2 years from meeting him. The trust came first. The trust came from her own hands and her own capital and her grandmother's name. It came from the lesson of the Black Notebook. You keep records not because anyone asks you to, but because the work deserves to be documented by someone who takes it seriously. She acquired 7 more farms in the 3rd year of the trust, each purchase negotiated directly with the landowner, no intermediary, no broker. She drove to each one herself. She sat in their kitchens and drank whatever they offered, coffee or sweet tea or water, and she listened to what they told her about the land before she said a word about price. Most of them had been farming for decades. They knew things about soil and drainage and seasonal behavior that no assessment report would ever capture. Imani learned it from them directly and wrote it in her own black notebook, the one she had started keeping after she left Nigeria, modeled precisely on Thei's. She met Marcus at a private investment conference in Charlotte when she was 28. He was tall and well-dressed and had a way of entering a room that made the room recalibrate slightly in his direction. He laughed quickly and easily. His handshake was confident and held a half-second longer than necessary. He pursued her over the following months with a persistence that she interpreted, for a time, as depth. They were married 2 years later. She wore the copper bracelet to the ceremony. In the 2nd year of their marriage, she tried once to explain what she was building. She sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table after dinner with the notebook open and walked him through the 80s land trust structure, the current holdings, the trajectory. She was 3 sentences in when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, looked back at her with a mild and pleasant expression, and said, "That's nice, baby." He picked up his phone. Imani looked at the notebook for a moment. She closed it. She put it back on the shelf. She did not try again. What nobody at any of those dinners understood was that the woman clearing the plates and asking polite questions about Marcus's colleagues was, at the same time, making decisions that would reshape the food supply infrastructure of an entire region. She reviewed acquisition proposals on Tuesday mornings before Marcus left for work. She signed processing contracts on Sunday evenings while he watched television in the next room. She took calls from her facilities managers at 6 in the morning and finished those calls and came to the kitchen and made coffee and said nothing because there was nothing she needed to say. The world that knew Imani through Marcus knew a quiet woman with an interest in agriculture, a background figure, someone who worked and traveled and kept herself somewhat separate from the full life of the marriage, as people who are absorbed in their work tend to do. The world that knew Imani through 80s Land Trust knew the majority owner of a $71 billion private agricultural enterprise, the operator, the decision maker, the person whose signature closed every deal and authorized every contract, and whose name appeared on every piece of land the trust had ever touched. These two worlds had never met. Marcus had been invited to 3 industry events in the agricultural sector over the years. At each one, someone in the room had looked at his name badge and then looked at him with an expression he could not quite decode. Not recognition exactly, more like adjustment, like a person recalibrating. He had never pursued what that expression meant. He had attributed it to his natural presence in a room, the way people noticed him when he arrived. He was not wrong that people noticed him. He was wrong about why. Carolyn had asked Imani once, at a family dinner in the 4th year of the marriage, what exactly she did for work. Not with hostility, with the mild condescension of a woman who had decided the answer was not particularly important but felt a polite inquiry was appropriate. Imani said she worked in agricultural investment. Carolyn said that was interesting and turned to ask Marcus about a friend's son who had just gotten a promotion. The copper bracelet was on Imani's left wrist. It was always on her left wrist. Carolyn had looked at it once, early in the marriage, and asked if it was a family piece. Imani had said yes. Carolyn had nodded and moved on. Nobody at any of the family dinners, not Carolyn, not Darnell, not Tamara, ever asked what the bracelet meant, or where it had come from, or what the small characters carved into it said. Nobody asked because nobody had thought to be curious about Imani in a way that might require them to revise what they already believed about her. That was the thing about people who build in silence. They leave the assumptions in place. The assumptions are useful. The assumptions are the room they work in while the room is being watched. It was not a painful decision. It was simply a clarification. Thei had never explained her notebook to anyone either. The land does not argue. You record what matters to you. You hold it. She held it. The trust grew. By the time Imani was 32, she had supply contracts with 2 regional distributors, which gave her the financing leverage to build the first processing facility. The second followed. The brands came after, 25 in total, positioned and expanded across a decade with the same patience she had applied to every other stage, each one wholly owned by the trust. No other name on the documents. At their 6th wedding anniversary dinner, Marcus raised a glass and said something about partnership and shared futures. Imani raised her glass with him. She smiled. She meant neither thing. She had already called Joe Quarty 3 weeks earlier. Josephine Quarty had been Imani's closest friend since their first year at Howard. She was now a corporate attorney in Atlanta, precise and thorough and constitutionally incapable of leaving anything ambiguous when clarity was available. She had been Thei's Land Trust's legal architect since the beginning. The person who had designed the structure of the trust not just to protect Imani's assets but to make their protection entirely, irrefutably clear. It already is, Joe had said, when Imani told her she needed everything reviewed. But I'll go through every line. A pause. Are we moving? Not yet, Imani said. But I want to be ready when we are. The divorce was filed the following year. Marcus's attorneys spent 4 months looking for a point of entry into the Thei's land trust assets. The prenuptial agreement, drafted by Joe Quarty and reviewed by Marcus's own attorney before the wedding, was specific and comprehensive. The trust had been established and operational for 2 years before their marriage. Its assets were entirely separate property. Every transaction, every signature, every financial decision in the trust's 14-year history had been made by Imani alone. Every door his attorneys opened led to the same room. The same conclusion, in 4 different legal memos. Nothing here. The Southern Agricultural Leadership Summit convened on a Thursday in October at the Georgia World Congress Center in downtown Atlanta. 3,000 delegates. 40 credentialed journalists from agricultural, business, and general press. 6 local television crews. The closing ceremony's centerpiece was the Innovator of the Decade Award, presented annually to the private individual whose work in agriculture and food systems had most measurably reshaped the sector over the preceding decade. Marcus had secured a speaking invitation through the summit's organizing committee. He had given 3 interviews to regional publications in the preceding months, positioning himself as a figure with family roots in the agricultural economy of the South. Carolyn had made 2 well-placed calls to people she knew on the organizing board. The speaking slot was confirmed. He had prepared remarks about legacy, about stewardship, about the South's agricultural future. He arrived at the summit with Vanessa beside him, Carolyn in the second row of the main hall, Darnell and Tamara to her left. They were dressed well and arranged like a family that expected a good outcome from the afternoon. Not one of them knew that Joe Quarty had couriered a package to the summit's organizing committee 6 weeks earlier. Not one of them had ever heard the name Thei's Land Trust spoken aloud. Not one of them had ever thought to ask what Imani did between their family dinners and their phone calls and the evenings she came home late, from trips she described only as work. Imani entered through the VIP entrance at 2:17, 90 minutes before the ceremony. She wore a dark navy wool suit cut close to her frame and tailored precisely. The copper bracelet was on her left wrist, showing below the sleeve. Her hair was pulled back low. She walked beside Joe Quarty. She did not hurry. She did not look for Marcus in the hall. She knew where everyone was. She had always known. Knowing things quietly was the work. The ceremony began at 4. The room was arranged with a central aisle and long rows of seating for delegates. A press table ran along the left side of the hall. At the front, a raised platform held the lectern and the summit's display screen. Marcus was introduced by name and took the podium to a moderate and pleasant applause. He stood easily, the way he always stood at microphones, shoulders relaxed, one hand light on the lectern edge. He spoke well. He always spoke well. He talked about the land and the legacy and the long work of feeding a country and the families who had done that work for generations. He said the word stewardship twice. He said the word vision once. The room listened with the moderate attention of an audience that is waiting for the main event. The lights changed. The display screen behind the podium shifted to a summit data presentation, an analysis of the largest private agricultural land holdings across the American South, compiled from public filings and property records spanning the preceding 15 years. The title appeared on the screen: Who Owns the Land? The first entry, Thei's Land Trust. 42 commercial agricultural properties across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas. 3 processing and distribution facilities. 25 registered food brands with active distribution in 47 states. 14 years of documented acquisition activity. Total asset valuation, $71 billion. Below the trust name, principal and sole signatory of record on all trust instruments, property deeds, and operating contracts, Imani Thei's Okafor Briggs. Joe Quarty moved through the press section without hurry, setting a bound briefing document face up before each of the 40 journalists. Each folder contained the complete corporate history of Thei's Land Trust, the original filing from 14 years prior, every acquisition deed in sequence, every signed contract, 14 years of documented decisions. Each one bore the same signature at the bottom of the page. The journalists opened their folders. Marcus stood at the podium and looked at the screen. He had stopped speaking. He was not processing the information quickly, which was the only mercy in the moment. His face held the particular stillness of a man whose body has already received news that his mind is still refusing to arrange into meaning. Imani came from the right side of the stage. She moved at her own pace. No hurry. The bracelet was on her wrist and she did not touch it. The hall went quiet the way a large space goes quiet when something irreversible is in motion. The silence traveled forward from the back, table by table, row by row, until the whole hall had stilled and there was nothing in it but the sound of Imani's footsteps on the stage. She reached the podium. She did not look at Marcus. He was beside her and then he was behind her, stepping to the side without anyone directing him to do so, because there was nowhere else to stand. Imani took the microphone. She looked at the room, at the journalists with their folders open, at the cameras repositioning, at 3,000 people who had come to a conference about land and were now in the presence of the person who owned the most of it. Her voice was level. It took up exactly the space it needed. A Thei's land trust was incorporated 14 years ago with $38,000 and one piece of land in Thei County. It now holds 42 farms, 3 processing facilities, and 25 food brands distributed across 47 states. Every acquisition in this portfolio was negotiated, financed, and closed by me. The land records are public. The trust documents are in your folders. I am here today to accept the Innovator of the Decade award on behalf of the people who work this land every day, and to announce that a Thei's Land Trust will be expanding its direct-to-farmer financing program into 6 new states beginning next quarter. She set the microphone down on the podium. She looked at Marcus. Once, for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. No anger in her face, no performance of composure, nothing staged for the cameras that were now pointed at her. Just a clear, settled look at a person she had known for 12 years and understood completely. She had simply seen him, the way you look at a place you have left, clearly and without regret, before you turn toward where you are going. Then she walked to the head of the board table on the stage's left and sat down. Joe Quarty was already in the adjacent chair. Imani opened the folder on the table in front of her, picked up her pen, and began to work. A journalist from the Farm Bureau Financial Services press pool raised her hand. Her voice carried the focused calm of a person who has been given a good story and knows it. Miss Okafor-Briggs, can you confirm the timeline for the 6-state financing expansion and whether Mississippi and Alabama are included in the first phase? Imani looked up from the folder. She answered the question. The cameras stayed on her. The questions from the press pool continued for 22 minutes. Imani answered each one directly, without elaboration beyond what was asked. The expansion timeline, the new states, the direct-to-farmer financing model, and how it differed from conventional agricultural lending, the trust's relationship with its current operator partners, her plans for the next 5-year acquisition phase. She was specific. She was complete. She gave the journalists what they needed to write accurate stories, because accurate stories were what the work deserved. At one point, a television reporter from a local station called from the second row of the press section, "Miss Okafor-Briggs, were you ever concerned that the scale of what you built would not be recognized, that it would be attributed to someone else?" Imani looked at him for a moment. "The documents are public record," she said. "The land doesn't change owners because someone else is standing in front of it." She looked back at the folder. The reporter wrote down what she had said. Several other journalists wrote it down. It would appear, word for word, in 11 of the 27 articles published the following morning. Marcus had been escorted to a side area of the convention center by the time the press session ended. He sat in a chair beside a water station with his phone in his hands and did not appear to be using it. He looked like a man in a waiting room who has forgotten what he was waiting for. Darnell found him there 20 minutes later and sat beside him without speaking for a while. Then he said something in a low voice that no one else heard. Marcus did not respond. They sat together for a while longer. Then Darnell stood up and walked toward the parking structure, and Marcus stayed where he was. Carolyn sat in the second row with her program in both hands. She did not stand. She did not move. She looked at the screen for a long time. Then she looked at the floor with an expression that had nothing in it. The expression of a person who has just understood that the architecture they were standing inside belongs to someone else entirely. Vanessa had been seated 3 chairs from Marcus at the central table. She looked at the screen. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the screen again. Then she pushed back her chair and stood and walked toward the far exit through the rows of seated delegates. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily, with a forward direction and no backward glance. Her jacket was still on the back of the chair. She did not come back for it. Darnell and Tamara sat still. The monthly disbursement from the Briggs Family Foundation's operating fund had been arriving for 6 consecutive years. Neither Darnell nor Tamara had examined its source. It came from a charitable services contract with Adais Land Trust that accounted for 38% of the foundation's operating capital. Joe Quarty had prepared the suspension letter 14 days prior. It had already been sent. Marcus stood at the lectern for 40 seconds after Imani left it. A summit volunteer came to the stage and guided him gently toward the side stairs. He went without resistance, the way a person moves when they are following instructions because there are no other options. He looked like a man walking through a building he has spent years standing in front of and just been told he has no relation to, which was accurate. The story ran in 27 publications the following morning. Every outlet assembled the facts the same way. A woman had built a $71 billion agricultural enterprise over 14 years in complete privacy. Her husband had spent a decade accepting credit for standing near her name. She had walked into a conference hall and said the true thing in a level voice, and then sat down and kept working. The photograph that ran on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was taken by a photographer who had moved to the edge of the stage during the question and answer period. It showed Imani's left hand, pen moving across a document, the copper bracelet visible at the cuff of her dark sleeve. Just her hand, just the work, just the bracelet. The caption read, Adais Land Trust founder Imani Okafor Briggs signs documents at the Southern Agricultural Leadership Summit, Thursday. Just the facts. That was enough. The legal proceedings surrounding the trust and the prenuptial agreement generated their own documentation over the weeks that followed. Marcus's attorneys produced 4 separate memos, each one examining a different theory of challenge, each one arriving at the same conclusion. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. The trust's premarital status was documented and indisputable. Every financial record in the trust's history bore one signature and one name. The district attorney's office did not ultimately pursue charges in connection with the summit. There had been no fraud, no misrepresentation, no wrongful claim filed against the trust. A man had given interviews implying relevance to an enterprise he had no documented connection to. Implication is not a crime. It is a cost that compounds over time and then comes due in a public room in front of 3,000 people and 40 journalists. That was sufficient accounting. Marcus moved into a rental apartment in Buckhead before the month ended. His attorneys filed their final review of the prenuptial agreement and advised him there was nothing to pursue. Every account he had attempted to access, every position he had attempted to claim, every argument his team had constructed over the preceding months collapsed against the same structure Joe Quarty had been quietly maintaining for 14 years. He now worked as an independent financial consultant for small private clients. His name appeared in press coverage only in subordinate clauses, always secondary to someone else's subject. Carolyn gave one interview after the summit to a publication she had nurtured for years. She spoke about family complexity and grace under pressure. The publication ran her interview alongside a sidebar presenting the corporate timeline of Adais Land Trust. 14 years of filings, every acquisition, every deed, every signature. After that interview, Carolyn stopped attending the charity events and the donor galas and the rooms she had spent decades cultivating. She withdrew from those rooms without a formal announcement. The rooms did not notice. Vanessa relocated to Nashville within the month. There was no further information. No one asked for it. Darnell found employment at a logistics company in Marietta. Tamara opened a hair salon in Decatur. Neither of them contacted Imani. Imani did not contact them. The morning after the summit, Joe Quarty came over at 7:30 with coffee from the Ghanaian bakery on Piedmont. They sat at Imani's kitchen table and spread the morning's papers out between them. 27 articles, 11 websites, 4 television segments that had already aired. Joe read pieces aloud in her deliberate way, setting each one face down after she finished. Imani listened and drank her coffee and said very little. At one point, Joe put down a paper and looked at Imani across the table. "You know what this means for the expansion?" "I know," Imani said. "The 6 new states will have 40 inquiries by end of week." "I know." Joe picked up another paper. They sat in the particular quiet that belongs to 2 people who have known each other long enough that silence between them is never empty. It is just rest. 11 months after the summit, Imani was on the back porch of a house she had purchased in Savannah. It was a wood frame house built in the 1940s, with a long rear porch looking out over a garden she had started from bare ground. Early morning, 6:15. The sky was still gray, moving from dark toward light, that slow shift before the sun commits to the day. The air carried damp earth and something green and the call of a dark bird from the tree stand at the left edge of the yard. She was on her knees at the garden's edge, pressing small wooden stakes into the soil along the bed's boundary, marking what was for which crop, what had rested, what was ready. On the porch step behind her, a black notebook lay open. She had been writing in it earlier. Yield estimates, soil notes, timing for the next planting cycle. She was not writing it for anyone to read. She was writing it because the land needed to know someone was paying attention. She pressed the last stake in and sat back on her heels. With her left hand, she touched the copper bracelet. She turned it once on her wrist. Slowly, she thought about Thei Obiageli on the front step in Enugu, bare feet in the red dirt before the sun was fully up, with the black notebook open on her knee, writing figures that nobody had requested. She thought about the boundary stakes. She thought about the way Thei had placed the bracelet in her palm in the early morning dark. Thei had closed her fingers over it without ceremony, without sentiment, without anything except the quiet transfer of one generation's attention to the next. She did not think about the summit. She did not think about Marcus, or the gala, or the name card that had given her only an initial. Those things had already been given their full accounting. They were done. What she thought about was the step in Enugu and the thin line of gold at the horizon and the weight of a copper bracelet in a girl's palm at the start of a very long and very particular journey. She did not feel triumph. Triumph needs an audience. Imani had never built for an audience. What she felt was closer to what you feel when something you planted a long time ago comes up out of the ground exactly as you knew it would. Not surprise, not vindication. Just the particular stillness of having been patient enough and prepared enough and quiet enough to let the work speak for itself when the time came. She stood up. She brushed the soil from her knees. She picked up her notebook from the porch step and walked back inside. In 40 minutes, her phone would ring. Her niece in Enugu, 14 years old and full of questions, calling on video from the house where Imani had grown up. The Ades Land Trust Student Exchange Program had accepted her 3 months ago. She would be in Atlanta in January. Imani had set the scholarship up 2 years prior, quietly, without telling anyone in the family. She had not told her niece until the letter arrived. The letter, like everything Imani built, had spoken for itself. She poured tea from the pot on the porch railing. She held the cup in both hands and stood at the edge of the steps and watched the sky go from gray to the first thin gold at the horizon. The bracelet was warm on her wrist. It was always warm. 14 years ago, she had sat in a county recorder's office in Telfair County, Georgia, at a plain desk. She had $38,000 saved from 5 years of careful work. She signed the first acquisition deed of Ades Land Trust. She had signed her full name, Imani Adaeze Okafor Briggs, clearly and completely, because her grandmother had taught her that you give a thing its full name, or you do not name it at all. That piece of land was now one of 42. The trust she had built in 14 years of silence had spoken, in a hall of 3,000 people, on a Thursday in October, in a voice that was level and direct and required no announcement of what it was. Because the land does not argue. It simply holds. And it held. If you know someone who builds in silence, drop the word land in the comments. They will understand why.